Warm welcome to Jeff Stoffer. Jeff.
Thank you, Dave. Actually, there's some pretty interesting psychology about those musician jokes, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, really happy to be here. I did grow up in this area. Probably would end up going to Prospect High School, except my parents moved that year, and I ended up going to Campbell High School. But lots of great memories here. In fact, cooking at La Mère Michelle on the main drag there in Saratoga, that was, say, more than 40 years ago. It was really actually inspirational for me because that's when I really started getting into cooking stuff from recipes and anyway, it was inspirational at the time for me as sort of being a young cook and really wanting to do a good job at it. So anyway, really happy to be here. And let's see, I'd like to start with a couple of questions if I could. How many of you would say that you've experienced some kind of financial setback in your life? Some kind of significant financial setback? Loss of investment, house underwater, anything like that? Okay. No, at any time. Okay, so if you could, just remember, just think back, sort of what that might have felt like. Could have been regret, could have been some anger, some blame, maybe you felt like a victim. Another question. How many people here have ever had difficulty having money conversations with a spouse or a relative? Difficulty having money conversations. Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. You meet somebody and they're very different from you, and sometimes you find that really attractive, right? And then later on, somehow, when it comes to money, you find out that you live with someone who believes some very different things about money than you do. And then lastly, how many people here would say they live a stressful life? It's a stressful life? Yeah, students, kids.
I don't drink enough.
You guys get booked up all the time, right? Your whole schedule's booked and pressure to do well.
It's when you wake up.
So all of these questions have something to do with emotions and our beliefs about money. And I think one of the things that kind of really surprised me about doing some of this work is that our beliefs about money actually began to be formed when we were kids. And some of those things are still with us today. So we're going to come at this from a number of different angles today. The first segment is going to be a little bit about the physiology of the brain and how it functions. And then through the eyes of a child, we're going to talk a little bit more about what are known as money scripts, some of those unconscious beliefs that we have about money that we get most often from our parents. And then lastly, the life on the savannah actually refers to something called evolutionary psychology and how the evolution of our species contributes to some of the ways that we respond to fear and things like that, and how those things that made us successful at staying alive on the savannah don't serve us well when it comes to investments. And lastly, emotions and money, all I'm going to do is revisit those three questions that I just asked and see if we can get some greater understanding for why we have some of those feelings around money. So here's a depiction of the brain, and the two lines going in towards the center, really what we're going to call here is the reflexive brain. And it's often been known as the limbic brain or the old brain, sometimes even referred to as lizard brain. And what that brain is good at is taking sights and sounds and smells and cues from the environment and giving us instant information about whether there's danger about, or dinner is going to be served, or something. So it leads us to rewards, but also keeps us safe from danger. In fact, its strength is that it's really fast. And if you think about it, we learn things and they become part of sort of our repertoire. And then after a while, you don't have to relearn them. You just do them. And you do them almost subconsciously. Like driving is a great example. So it is like our subconscious. And growing up, as kids, we're little information sponges, right? We take in all these things that we hear from our parents, and okay, sorry. So we take in these things as kids, and they become part of us, and it's almost like programming. We have these memories inside of us that stick with us, right? So, and being subconscious, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that at being subconscious, we don't think about these things. And the driving the car example is the most easiest one to identify with, in that you get into your car, you drive a half an hour, and you get out at your destination, and you don't really remember driving there, right? Because it was so automatic. Maybe you tuned in for a couple of seconds when somebody was going to cut into your lane or something like that. But it was practically automatic. So when I thought of somebody who lived purely from their subconscious and most likely not to have a prefrontal cortex, Homer Simpson came to mind. And I think it's just so funny. He's here with all his sort of favorite treats. But anyway. So his subconscious is probably most likely really running the show. So the other part of the brain that I was referring to, was actually in that diagram, was the cortex, right? And particularly the prefrontal cortex. And this is supposedly the thing that makes us so unique here on this planet. And it's really like the CEO function, if you will. It's the planning, the decision-making, analysis, those sorts of things. Well, the interesting thing about and what I call this the reflective brain. The thing that's interesting about the reflective brain, its strengths are that we can make rational decisions, we can do analysis and things like that. But the fact is, it's so much slower than the reflexive brain. The reflexive brain is some 40 times faster than our conscious mind. So often our emotions can get triggered and be taking us down one path before our conscious brain actually gets involved in the discussion, as it were. Another thing about the reflective brain is that it gets tired. And it likes the shortcuts. So it lets the subconscious do what it will. And if you think about, let's say late at night, and you're thinking, oh man, I'd really love to have a cookie. And you're exhausted, and you don't want to really think about it and debate whether or not you should have the cookie or not. You just say, I'll go have that cookie. Because it feels right, and it's easy, and it's an easy decision, because it's almost made subconsciously, right? So it's slow, it gets tired, and since the reflexive brain can act so quickly, your subconscious can react so quickly, your emotions can actually hijack your ability to make a conscious choice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So these numbers always kind of freak me out, because I was really surprised to read them, and I've come across them in a number of different places. But 95%, and this is a number arrived at by neuroscientists, saying that we use our subconscious 95% of the time, and only this awesome thinking reflective brain about 5% of the time. I've seen the 90-10 split, but nowhere near 50-50 or anything like that. So a lot of what we do and a lot of choices we make are almost automatic and subconscious. So as mentioned earlier, our beliefs about money began to be formed through the eyes of a child. And actually what I'd like you to think about right this second is go back as far as you possibly can in your past and think about your first experience involving money. So where were you? How was money involved? Did you buy something? I'll show you my first one, then I'd be interested to hear some of yours. So it actually wasn't very far from here. It was on Saratoga Avenue. There was a 7-Eleven near where I used to live. And I remember, I think I was about 5 years old, because that's when we moved here. And I remember walking into that 7-Eleven with a nickel. And I walked out with a piece of bubble gum and 3 little, those hard candies. And I thought that was like the greatest thing ever. You know, that you could go in there and you could come out with some candy. And it was a great thing. Curious, anybody else what do you come up with?
When I was 7 or 8, I would save 25 cents, from an allowance, and then you could buy a 25-cent stamp and put it in a little book, and when you get to $18.75, you purchase a $25 savings bond.
Well, I remember my first savings account was at the First National Bank. It was First National Bank at that time, but it's on the corner of Stevens Creek and Saratoga, I think. And back then, I remember what the interest rate was because they had one of those big poles up there. It's at 7%. And I didn't have $100 yet, but I knew the math is that if I put $100 in there and left it there for a year, I'd make $70 and I wouldn't have to do a darn thing for it. Anyway, other stories, please. Anybody?
I remember as a kid running after the ice cream truck that would come in our neighborhood regularly during the summer.
Yeah.
I remember always having to ask for money to go and get an ice cream.
All right. Oh, there, way in the back.
Similar thing. I remember the ice cream truck. I remember not wanting to ask my parents for money for the ice cream truck because of the conflict that might create. Because they had conflict about money many times.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, and it's interesting how we remember those things, right? Yeah. Please.
I had one of those books, but I never got it filled up because I spent too many nickels on candy.
All right. So we all have these stories, and it's funny, and we have experiences as kids, and something as seemingly innocuous as, take that money out of your mouth, it's filthy. It may seem like a good health reason to to discipline the kid and say, get that out of your mouth. But, certain things like that can get reinforced through our lives, and, it's being somewhat older, you might have some kind of beliefs about money, that it's not good, or, those sorts of things. So what comes out of this growing up is this idea of money scripts. So we have these things that we believe about money, often that we've heard growing up. And here are just some of the most common ones. More money will make things better. Oh, money's bad. There will never be enough money. Anybody, people see things here that they recognize, or they feel like that might be true for them? Because it's like we as adults can sit there and argue one side or the other of these things, but really, deep we have some kind of belief about it. And I can tell you, mine was, there will never be enough. Being a saver from early on, and thinking that somehow more money would make me feel more secure, and that sort of thing.
I would say my family would say it's not nice to talk about.
Yeah.
I had no idea what my parents made as far as money.
I don't either. So anyway, I'm reading this really interesting book right now, and it's called The Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge. And it's really cool because despite the fact that Scrooge had wealth, he also had some beliefs about money that made him actually live in poverty, right? He didn't want to pay to heat his house. He didn't want to light the thing. He had one candle. It was cold. So he actually lived a life of financial and emotional poverty despite the fact of having money. And I think I put a few of his, whoops, I don't want to go back, because I made a note of a couple of his money scripts, so his beliefs about money. You can't trust anyone with your money. You must work hard for money. Don't spend on yourself or on others. Giving to the poor encourages laziness. If you had more money, things would be better. So pretty amazing. And I think it's interesting about these money scripts. It's difficult to ferret them out and discover what they are without going through some sort of processes or sort of being aware in some kind of situation that you notice that, oh, this has something to do with how I feel about money. And paying attention to our emotions around some of this stuff is really key to garnering some of the insights. So in evolutionary terms, it wasn't that long ago that we did live in small tribes. We were hunters and gatherers. We lived in small communities. And this is, pre 10,000 years ago when, large cities began to be formed. And the daily experience of danger and life-threatening danger was just part of life, right? And the people that survived were the ones that processed the information the quickest, right? They were alert to danger, and they were able to do something about it. Well, it turns out our nervous systems, evolved hundreds of thousands of years like this. And it turns out that there's certain things that we can respond to now that don't serve us well when it comes to investments. And then another interesting thing about this, so it stimulates this fight or flight syndrome. And chemically what it is, it's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenals. And when you sense something that's put you in danger, these three systems generate chemicals into your body almost instantaneously and alerts us to danger and prepares us to do something about it. And interestingly enough, prolonged stress, so even if you aren't fearful about something, prolonged stress can activate that HPA axis and generate a response, an emotional response that has your body believing that it's actually in danger. And so a common one here, and people have all heard about fear and greed in the markets, and this guy created this great slide. And if you think back, back in, say, 2007, when you're hearing people are still making money in their houses, the stock market's hitting new highs, and say your 401k is, you've got it invested in the most secure thing. And it's kind of like earning 1% or 2% or something. So you think, wow, gee, I'm hearing that, market's going up, people are making money, I should be able to do this too. So you move some money into some stock-like investments. And sure enough, 6 to 9 months later, the market starts to roll over. You get your statement 3 or 4 months later, whatever, and you're down. Say you're down 10%, or even $10,000, or some specific amount, and already you have an emotional response. You're already feeling regret. Wow, that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. So if you recall back at the Great Recession and the bear market that ensued, the S&P 500, the largest stock index here in the United States, went down about 57 or 58% from peak to trough. So if you can imagine, say halfway down that line, now you can't even bear looking at the statements. You go to the mailbox, you pick up a statement, it says Vanguard, and you feel sick to your stomach. There's stuff going on inside. And pretty soon, maybe you're feeling like this is not safe. I can't afford to lose much more. This is my retirement money. And then pretty soon your body is like screaming at you to do something to make it feel better. And sure enough, at the bottom, you sell. Sure enough, 6 to 9 months later, stocks start to go back up. But the lesson you learned was so painful, you can't go back. It's going to take years or a heck of a long time for you to even consider going back and investing in stocks. So what this kind of points to, part of it is somewhat is like a herding behavior, right? When we think everybody else is doing it, as social animals, we look to our group, our social group, for cues. What's acceptable? What's a good idea? What's something good to do with your money now? Those sorts of things. And somehow when there's some consensus around it or everybody else believes it, it somehow seems less risky. Or we suspend our sort of critical evaluation of it and think, well, yeah, that sounds good. It's probably okay. And when in fact in the markets, it really is the people that are contrarian, the ones that are willing to go against the prevailing wisdom, as it were, that actually make the money. And what this really points to, this graph, the thing that's kind of strange about it is like, it seems so obvious, right? And in ways it seems kind of stupid, repeat until broke. But the thing that's powerful about it is that it's not rational. It is emotional. And what it really points to then is, that the difficulty of, say, timing when to get in the market, when to get out, or buying last year's hot mutual fund because it's hot and everybody else was buying it, right? So it must be good. So the futility sort of timing the market, chasing last year's hot performer, just is not a way to make money in the markets. So it sometimes seems that we have the brains of Homer Simpson when it comes to investing. There's more than a little truth to that. In fact, there's some data to back it up. So every year this company named Dalbar does their quantitative analysis of investor behavior. And this is a 20-year period from 1990 to 2010. And what's really notable about it is that it includes the tech bubble bursting in the early 2000s and also the Great Recession. And so the orange bar on your left is an index, the S&P 500 that I referred to earlier. Over that 20-year period, the index returned just over 9%. That's 9% per year. The yellow bar to the next is the experience of the average stock mutual fund investor, less than 4% per year. So a whopping disparity of about 5.25%. Each and every year for 20 years. That's a lot of money left on the table. Again, what's accounting for a lot of that behavior is people like chasing performance, getting in too late, selling when they're fearful, all those sorts of things that, and these are things that are, as I said, emotional and often stimulated by our subconscious. That reflexive brain we were talking about earlier. Okay. All right, so back to the questions there. Experience of financial setbacks. You remember what that feels like. And it does stimulate your subconscious. It can stimulate feelings of fear. And when you're fearful, it's hard to make conscious choices. It's really difficult to engage your thinking brain when your body is sort of full of these chemicals that make you think you're unsafe. The conversation with spouses is really interesting because it can feel like with couples, particularly if you've been together a long time, you can almost, you might bring some sort of anxiety just to the conversation. And you're really highly attuned to how your significant other responds to something that you might say. And clearly there's, and it's Dave and I were talking a little bit earlier about how one spouse can feel really differently about the money. So, particularly when people are retired, it's like the wife, say, wants to travel, but the husband is scared to death that there's not going to be enough money. So they don't, or they travel very little. So in those instances, it is really hard to have conversations about money because they're so emotionally charged. And what I like to suggest that people do is start with things that are sort of high level, like what are the most 2 or 3 most important things to us? And is our money going towards those things? And looking for the common ground on areas on which you agree. And don't ever start a conversation with, honey, do you know how much you spent at Costco last week? And the constant stresses in our lives, job security, change is happening so fast. And those are the types of things, the chronic stress build up, things like that can influence how we make choices. When we've got these money scripts in the background, things we believe about money, they may be affecting the choices we make as well. So I'd like to ask you right now, does any of this sound familiar? Do you recognize any of yourself in this? Like, what does all this mean? Any thoughts? Please. It sounds like you got something going on over there. No? What do you think? No? Yeah, please. Take care.
I would just point out that people should really pay attention to the number that you reported, the approximately 9%, and then the number 3.83 or whatever it is, because people should really consider why that happens. That's huge. It's a huge difference.
It is.
And so to try to put yourself in the position where you're in the 9% category, not the 3.83 category.
Right.
It's not easy.
Yeah, it is. But so to your point, and to elaborate on that a bit, it talks about the importance in that instance, in that time period, of being able to earn a 9% return by owning an index. And so this is not some portfolio manager picking stocks, trying to perform or anything. It's just holding an index, and it's cheap. It's not expensive to hold the index. The hard part is the behavioral part, like sticking with it through thick and thin, and being able in the market that long to realize that return. Because once you make the choice to get out, then you have to figure out how to get back in, and that often just detracts from your returns over time. Anybody else, any other thoughts about this, about your beliefs about money? Do you see any of yourself in some of these?
That's why I have somebody else make decisions for my money. I don't.
Yeah.
Because I don't trust my emotions to do things intelligently.
It's a good thought. It's certainly to have somebody to bounce ideas off of and talk you off the ledge whenever you're thinking about doing something crazy. Right?
There's an interesting book by Nobel laureate Robert Shiller called Irrational Exuberance, which talks about behavioral economics and why people make the decisions that they do, the herd mentality in particular, and people follow a crazy thought process as far as what motivates them to invest and when they invest. And he's got some science, well, not science, statistics behind his thinking. He won the Nobel Prize. He's a Yale professor. He's a very interesting character.
Yeah, he's got articles in the New York Times, and occasionally business section too. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? About beliefs about money? Yeah, please.
You haven't said anything about diversifying your investments to reduce your stress.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because at the heart we're talking about money, but at the same time we're also talking about psychology. And as I found that this talk has sort of gravitated more towards the psychology than the money side. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure you guys have financial advisors here in your group and that sort of thing. But there's certainly value in diversification. I mean, they call it the closest thing you get to a free lunch, right, in investing. So, yeah, always good advice. All right, well, that's really all I have here. I guess to wrap it up, I think, it's challenging to make good choices all the time. It's very challenging, I think, given the fact how much our subconscious sort of rules the roost in terms of the choices we make. So I will use that as sort of a segue into, part of the beauty of financial planning and the process is that it does help people make more conscious choices around their values and their priorities, and to see where their money's going, and see that their money's going to those things that matter most. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to invest this red wine with you from one of our own Rotarian members. And thank you for coming and addressing our group. And remember, folks, we're going to break down the tables and the chairs. So the meeting is now officially adjourned, but let's go ahead and get everything cleaned up as soon as possible, and we will see you next week. Thank you.